Hello and welcome back to Monetize Me. My name is Jay and today we're going to be going over emergency funds. So what exactly is an emergency fund? Well, much like it sounds, all an emergency fund is a financial buffer between you and emergencies. This is money that you intentionally set aside specifically for the worst case scenarios. Maybe you lose your job. Maybe you get into a car accident. Or maybe some other emergency arises where you now have a bunch of unexpected bills starting to pile up with no idea how you're going to pay for it all. With an emergency fund set aside, you're financially prepared for all of these tragedies before they happen. The last thing you want is to be caught off guard by sudden expenses that you can't afford and be forced to go rack up debt in order to cover them. Now, how much money you should be putting into your emergency fund is going to vary case by case. It can depend on a lot of things, like how much you're making, what your monthly expenses are, or even who you're asking. There are a lot of different opinions on this topic. And in the end, it all comes down to personal preference. What matters most is how safe you want to feel. A typical emergency fund is going to cover anywhere from 3 to 6 months worth of expenses on the low end, all the way up to 9 to 12 months of expenses on the high end. 3 to 6 months does seem to be the sweet spot and is the amount highly recommended by most experts. If you do lose your job, odds are you should be able to find another job within 6 months. And in the case of a medical emergency, 3 to 6 months worth of expenses should be able to cover either the deductible or at least a large portion of the bill. On the other hand, 9 to 12 months worth of expenses in your bank account could be a bit overboard. The more money that you're taking and setting aside for these emergencies, the less money you're going to have available to invest. Setting aside too much money can greatly hinder your portfolio growth, especially if you're just starting out. The last thing you want to do is get so caught up in these short-term worst-case scenarios that you forget to take a step back and focus on the overall picture. If long-term growth is the goal, which for many it is, you need to be careful that you don't get too distracted or sidetracked at any step along the way. You need to remain focused on that end goal. When it comes to finances, the game is all about efficiency and tactics, not just brute force. This is why an emergency fund is so highly recommended and everybody should have one. This isn't just for the financial purposes that it's serving. This is also for peace of mind. You have the security of knowing that if something bad does happen, then you at least have your money to fall back on. Additionally, staying focused and disciplined is much easier when you don't have all these financial worries floating around in the back of your mind. Not only that, but it can also relieve a ton of stress during the emergencies themselves. When everything goes wrong and your mind is racing at 110 miles an hour, the last thing you want to be thinking is how on earth am I going to pay for all this? Now, that's not to say that there's nothing else you can do to prepare for those worst case scenarios, but it's definitely a great place to start. So, where do I stand on all this? I personally keep 6 months worth of expenses in my savings account at all times. I don't look at it, I don't move it, I don't touch it. If something bad does happen and I start getting a bunch of unexpected bills piling up, 3 months of expenses might not be enough to cover it. It might, but if it's not, I don't want to be forced to go rack up debt in order to cover it, even if it's just temporarily. Now, on the opposite side of the spectrum, I don't want to have too much capital just sitting around either. I'd be much more comfortable knowing that I have that money invested and growing for me elsewhere. 9 to 12 months worth of expenses saved up sitting in my bank account is just too much stagnant capital for my taste. The anxiety I'd get from having that much money just sitting there, knowing full well that I could have that money invested and growing and compounding elsewhere, especially while I'm young, that would outweigh any security I'd feel from having that much money to fall back on. Now, where do I keep my emergency fund? I like having my emergency capital highly liquid and really easy to access at all times. This is why I just keep it in my savings account. Now, before anybody yells at me, I know you could keep your emergency fund in a money market account or in CDs and get slightly higher yields than you would if you had your money sitting in a savings account. But for me, in my opinion, it's just not worth the hassle. With some of these other options, it might be a little bit harder to get a hold of your money if you're in a hurry. And in my opinion, that defeats the whole purpose of having an emergency fund in the first place. An emergency doesn't care if your money's tied up in a CD for another month. It doesn't care if it's harder to get a hold of your money. It's just gonna happen. And I'd much rather have it in my savings account where I can get to it on a moment's notice. Even if that means I'm missing out on an entire 0.5% that I could be making if I move my emergency fund somewhere else. But feel free to disagree. Yell at me in the comments. Go ahead. I'll live. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate your time. Be sure to hit that like button, subscribe. It means a lot and it really does help a lot more than you think. And hopefully I was able to add a little bit of value back to your life as well.